The 20th century saw the collapse of European colonial empires as African, Asian, and Latin American nations gained political independence. However, as Kwame Nkrumah argues in Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, this independence was often an illusion. The real power over these nations did not disappear, it simply changed form. According to Nkrumah, Neo-colonialism is a system where former colonial powers and new imperialist forces continue to control supposedly independent nations through economic, political, and military means. In many ways, this is an even more insidious form of domination, as it operates under the guise of sovereignty while denying nations true self-determination. At the heart of Nkrumah's argument is the idea that the mechanisms of colonial rule did not vanish with the lowering of European flags. Instead, these mechanisms were repurposed and concealed under the language of free markets, globalization, and international cooperation. This book, published in 1965, meticulously exposes the structures of economic control that persist in the post-colonial world. In this video, we will closely examine Nkrumah's arguments, ensuring that his words and insights remain central to our discussion today. Nkrumah begins by stating unequivocally that, open quote, "Neo-colonialism is the worst form of imperialism," end quote. Unlike direct colonial rule, where foreign governments openly exercised authority, neo-colonialism operates through economic dependency and financial control. He writes, open quote, "The essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside," end quote. One of the key aspects of neo-colonialism is economic domination. Multinational corporations, banks, and former colonial powers dictate the economies of post-colonial states, ensuring that these nations remain producers of raw materials rather than industrialized economies. This structure forces former colonies into a cycle of underdevelopment, as their resources are extracted at low prices while finished goods are imported at high prices. Political puppetry further reinforces this system, as leaders who resist are undermined, overthrown, or assassinated, while compliant rulers, what Nkrumah calls the, open quote, comprador bourgeoisie, end quote, are rewarded with wealth and power. Financial dependence is solidified through international loans, particularly from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which then impose conditions that limit national sovereignty and prevent independent economic development. Military influence is maintained as well, with former colonial powers establishing military bases and directly intervening when their interests are threatened. One of the most striking elements of Nkrumah's analysis is his focus on multinational corporations as the primary agents of neo-colonial control. He explains how these corporations, mostly headquartered in imperialist countries, wield immense power over supposedly independent states. Open quote, "In neo-colonial territories, foreign capital is used for exploitation rather than for development," end quote. Investment in foreign firms does not lead to self-sufficient industrialization. Rather, it locks these nations into a dependent relationship where their economies remain extractive and vulnerable to external forces. The example of Ghana's gold and cocoa industries highlight this reality. Even after achieving formal independence, the production, pricing, and trade of these key resources remained under control of foreign firms. The economic structures that governed these industries had not changed, meaning that Ghana continued to function as a supplier of raw materials for Western markets while being denied the ability to process and manufacture these goods domestically. This ensures that the wealth of African nations continues to flow outward, leaving these people in poverty despite the abundance of resources beneath their feet. A common misconception is that foreign aid serves as a benevolent tool to assist developing nations. Nkrumah, however, exposes foreign aid as a calculated strategy to maintain economic dependence. He writes, open quote, "Aid given by capitalist countries is merely a revolving credit, paid by the neo-colonial territories to their masters in an even larger sum than originally received." End quote. The reality of aid is that it often comes with stringent conditions that force nations to privatize industries, to deregulate their economies, and to implement austerity measures that reduce social spending and increase economic vulnerability. These policies primarily benefit foreign investors while depriving the local population of essential public services and economic security. Furthermore, foreign aid serves as a justification for continued military presence. Under the guise of protecting investments and stabilizing economies, imperialist nations maintain a foothold in former colonies, ensuring that resistance to neo-colonialism is suppressed. As Nkrumah makes clear, open quote, "Financial aid is but a method by which the developing countries maintain a stranglehold on the economies of the developing world." End quote. Nkrumah is highly critical of international organizations like the United Nations, arguing that they serve the interests of imperialist powers. He asserts, open quote, "The United Nations, in its present composition, serves as the instrument of the big powers. It is a cloak for the continued economic domination of the weak by the strong." End quote. Although the United Nations projects itself as a neutral body for global cooperation, Nkrumah explains that its decision-making processes are dominated by the wealthiest and most militarily powerful states. This ensures that policies unfavourable to imperialist powers are obstructed, while those that reinforce economic dependency are promoted. Similarly, institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund claim to assist development, but in practice enforce economic policies that perpetuate dependency. These institutions dictate terms to post-colonial states, ensuring that their economies remain subordinate to the capitalist core. The structural adjustment programs imposed by these organizations force nations to prioritize debt repayment to core capitalist nations over domestic social spending, further entrenching poverty and economic stagnation. The effects of neocolonialism are devastating. Underdevelopment is institutionalized as former colonies remain economically subordinate despite their vast natural wealth. Political instability is widespread, as leaders who challenge imperialism are frequently removed through coups or economic sabotage. Military interventions persist as imperialist powers use force when economic pressures alone are insufficient. Cultural domination further reinforces this system, with education systems and media promoting the idea that capitalism and Western-style governance are the only viable paths for development. Nkrumah warns that, open quote, "So long as neocolonialism exists, the liberation of Africa is impossible." End quote. He insists that true independence requires dismantling the economic structures that perpetuate imperialist control, rather than merely removing colonial administrators from government offices. Despite the grim reality of neocolonialism, Nkrumah presents a clear path towards true liberation. He argues that only through industrialization and economic self-sufficiency can post-colonial nations achieve independence. Regional cooperation is essential. As he asserts, open quote, "A united Africa, that is the only way we can prevent neocolonialism from strangling us." End quote. He calls for socialist economic policies that prioritize national development over foreign profit, rejecting the capitalist dependency model imposed by the imperial powers. For Nkrumah, revolution is not a political necessity, but an economic one. Breaking free from neocolonialism requires a fundamental restructuring of global economic relations. He warns that without this transformation, political independence will remain nothing more than a facade. Over a half century after its publication, Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, remains as relevant as ever. Many African, Asian, and Latin American nations continue to experience the same economic exploitation that Nkrumah described all that time ago. The structures of imperialist domination persist, repackaged under new terminology, but serving the same function. Nkrumah's central lesson is clear. Political independence is meaningless without economic independence. The struggle against neocolonialism is not over. It is simply evolved. Open quote, political independence is but a facade if it does not include economic independence. The struggle continues.